Welcome back to Derry Public Radio. Reporting from the basement of the Derry Civic Center, this is CM Alexander with the news. On the community calendar, Derry is welcoming touring orator Stephen Spignesi, an acclaimed author and expert on Stephen King. Can you imagine dedicating so much time to one author's work? I wonder what that must feel like, listeners. You're listening to Derry Public Radio. This is Derry Public Radio.
Welcome back to Derry Public Radio, a bi-weekly Stephen King Book Club podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Joshua Kahn, alongside CM Alexander.
Hello, everyone.
And today, joining us as a guest is a writer and author of more than 60 books. He is a retired practitioner in residence from the University of New Haven. He is considered an authority on Stephen King, even appearing in the A&E biography of Stephen King. His sixth book about King is Stephen King, American Master. Please welcome to the show, Stephen Spignesi. Stephen, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for making the time to be here with us.
My pleasure.
So, CM, are you ready to kick things off? I know if you've listened to any of our interviews before, CM has a very important job at the very top of all of our interviews.
My first question is about your introduction to Stephen King's work. What was your very first experience with Stephen King?
Sure. It was The Shining. It was 1977. I had just gotten married. I had somehow missed Carrie and the Carrie movie. And on our honeymoon, I just had picked up the paperback of The Shining, and I read it in like one reclining, I'll say. I was on the couch laying down reading it, and it just absolutely blew me away. And what struck me most was that this is not normal, average pop kind of horror. This was literature. And of course, now we all kind of accept that The Shining is one of King's most literary works. So that just spurred me. I had to find everything he had written, and I took it, and it went from there. I was working on a book about the Andy Griffith Show at the time called Mayberry, My Hometown. Big fan. Opie, Andy, Aunt B, the whole crew. Yeah. And I talked to my publisher. And I said, I'm considering, what would you think of a Stephen King book? And it was years before it actually came into fruition. But my next book for them was the Stephen King Encyclopedia. So the launching was the reading of The Shining.
Wow,
that's outstanding.
In our podcast, we like to talk about what we call Stephen King moments that gets stuck in your mind and just does something to you. Is there one, if you could only pick one, that would be your top Stephen King moment?
Oh, wow. One. Yeah, one moment. I'm going to actually go on a limb and say no. I can't nail it. I can't nail it down to one. I've been reading and studying his stuff for so many years, and so many things, so many scenes, so many moments, so many turns of phrase have simply just become just important and iconic to me. I mean, there's a quote from the Regulators about sprinklers that it just really moved me in terms of the beauty of its language. King's poetry moves me and stays with me. Paranoid, Dark Man, Harrison State Park. Then there are scenes, specific scenes. The Danny Glick at the window scene in Salem's Lot on through even the story, The Thing at the Bottom of the Well, which was King's People, Places, and Things story, which was the very, very first use of, it was the kernel, as in Kernel, kernel image of Pennywise, of it. This little kid is a real creep, and he pulls wings off flies, and he ends at one day he hears a voice from the bottom of the well, come on down, we'll have great fun. And he's found later with his arms and legs pulled off. And it was clearly...
That's amazing!
Yeah, and he wrote that, when he was a teenager, because People, Places, and Things was published when he was a kid. Him and Chris Chesley wrote one-page horror sci-fi short stories. The disgusting dedication storyline.
Oh, yeah, dedication, man.
A more recent example, I loved his one-act play, Thin Scenery, that appeared in the literary journal Plowshares last summer. And then, of course, the hobbling scene, the whole first edition of The Gunslinger, not the rewrite, the original 5 short stories read in toto just really blew me away. I absolutely love it. The suicide ending of Last Drung, his nonfiction essay, Guns, that's very, very powerful. In Bizarre Bad Dreams, there's a short story I absolutely adore. It's called Afterlife. And I'm actually thinking about writing a script based on that story. So King's work across the board, fiction, nonfiction, theatrical stuff, poetry, recipes, have been with me for so long, and I'm just such a huge fan that it's almost impossible. It's like going to Dr. PhD of English literature, in England, and saying, "What's your favorite Shakespeare play?" And then he spends a week talking about how you can't ask that question, and here's why. I cannot single out a particular moment. I can single out The Shining as my introduction to King, and I can also kind of single out works like that have very, very powerfully moved me over the years, particularly recently, Elevation. Elevation was really kind of like a novella. 25,000, 28,000 words, whatever it was. And it was published as a small hardcover, which is amazing because novellas are almost never published singularly. But when it's King, there is no, traditionally.
Right.
And Elevation, it's a Christ allegory. I mean, the main character basically is a metaphor, a symbol for the Christ legend, including ascension, elevation, themes of the body. And I just said, this is clearly obvious of the spiritual growth in King's work in recent years. So I've been kind of like watching his focus. And, in 1987, when It came out, he said, this is it. This is my swan song for writing about monsters. And of course, as Pennywise, they all made an appearance, right? Mummy, Frankenstein, Wolfman. And he said, I'm now going to focus on the monsters within. And then we have works like Dark Half, which is the writer's duality. The brain is literally split. And there was a physical explanation for it in the book, but the notion of a writer having this duality is just evidence that, King's work is beyond just, ooh, I'm going to get scared, No. This guy is writing great American literature that is going to be read, enjoyed, studied in 50 years, 100 years, exactly the way Dickens and Poe and Lovecraft and Mary Shelley are today. One of the big things I always kind of talk about when I do lectures on my books and King is that let's not take him for granted. And let's not take Paul McCartney for granted. And let's not take the work of truly iconic artists for granted, because we're alive when they're continuing to produce. And one example I always refer to is Rodgers and Hammerstein. 1939, they released Oklahoma. There were people who stood in line to get tickets and heard Oklahoma, for the first time. And now it's this unimaginably important and popular Broadway show. And yet our grandparents possibly saw it live as a new work. And so that kind of perception is very important to me. So that's part of the reason why I did American Master, which, believe it or not, is 17 years since my last King book. So I just consider them important enough to warrant that kind of commitment and study.
I think you're absolutely right. And I love that that's something you talk about. We've had these conversations with guests, or when CM and I have been interviewed by other sources having conversations about, for instance, Pet Sematary. Pet Sematary isn't about a graveyard that brings things back to life. It's about the overwhelming power of grief and loss, and just like how far your heart can break is like the source of that book. And it's so great knowing somebody like you is out there writing about these things so that people who miss these connections their first time around can discover them. So before we get back to King stuff, I just want to ask you, you have published more than 60 books, which is wild. When did you know that writing was the thing you wanted to do with your life?
When I was 9. It was right after my dad had passed away, and I was only 9. He was only 36. In fact, I've written a screenplay called Blatchley Avenue, which is being shown now, and it's about the last 2 months of his life. He got sick on the 4th of July and died the day before Labor Day. That was it, 2 months. Yeah, it was awful. But for some reason, it spurred me, and I took out my loose-leaf notebook paper and a blue Bic pen, and I just wrote a short story. And it was generously and kindly could be called a spy parody or satire. And my mother, God rest her soul, she just passed last year. She was at 90. She was my first editor, and she read. Oh yeah, she was. She read voraciously. Belonged to the Book of the Month Club. Let me read anything. I mean, I read Peyton Place when I was, 8 years old. Let me read anything. Yep, and.
That is wild, that young to read that. That's awesome.
Oh, yeah. The biography of one of the astronauts she let me read, and anything that came in the Book of the Month Club, after she read it, if I wanted to, she'd let me. And so she read my spy story, and she was... It's funny now, but she said, it boiled down to maybe you should kind of get a little older before you try your hand at trenchant satire. And I said, oh, okay. And so I just continued writing stuff that is lost to this day. In the early 70s, I started taking it very seriously. And in my late teens, early 20s, and started writing. I actually wrote a book about Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, which Ballantyne very kindly said, we own that. So you can't really write a book about our characters and our books without our permission, and we're not licensing anything at the moment. But it was a good experience,
Sure.
And so then I just continued from there until I sold my first book in 1984, the Mayberry book, and that didn't come out until 1987. But by then, I had started working on the King Encyclopedia, my Stephen King Encyclopedia, and that took 5 years of research and reading just to be able to write. And that came out in 90, 850,000 words, 8.5 by 11 pages. It's massive, absolutely massive. It's a huge doorstop. It really is. 18,000 A to Z entries of every person, place, and thing in King's work through 1990. Complete Castle Rock Index, to which I was a contributor at the time. 30 interviews with directors and writers. I interviewed Richard Matheson. I have the only interview with Dave King, Steve's brother. And he sent me a bunch of stuff from King's childhood. And it was, I've been told, the last book that King officially sanctioned. And when I was working on that, I talked to, my agent talked to, on my behalf, Elaine Coster, who was King's editor at Penguin. And I said, here's the thing. I'm doing all this research. I have mountains of research materials. Let's spin it off into a quiz book. And she went for it. She says, yeah, it's a good idea. And the encyclopedia was still, 2 years away from being published or whatever. So then I did the quiz book. And from there, I did a second quiz book, which as a sequel. And then Lost Work of Stephen King, The Essential Stephen King, and then Stephen King, American Master. And while I'm doing all this, I also got a job, I wasn't an employee, but I was a freelance worker for John Wiley and Son. You know the For Dummies books?
Yeah.
Yeah, the black, yellow, and gold cover and so forth. Microsoft Word for Dummies and so forth. Well, I've written 4 of them.
What?
And yeah, I've written 4 Dummies books, and they are brutal. And I always tell students, that was a trial by fire in terms of being able to do intensive research, very, very quick assimilation, and very rapid writing, because you get 6 months to write a Dummies book. And they're written to template, and you have to turn in a chapter a week. And then you get it back 2 weeks later with notes. So you're editing, researching, and writing all at the same time. And the last one I did for them was in 2012 for the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. I did Titanic for Dummies and actually taught a course on it at University of New Haven. And what was real fun, and I talk about it all the time as being one of those really rare moments in academia. The course I taught was the literature and history of the Titanic, and my book was the course text, and the school paid for them.
Nice.
The UNH bought 25 copies of my book, the size of the class, and shipped them to me. And I handed them out. My students did not have to pay for them. And at the very end of the course, I signed them for them, and the course was over. And it was great, great fun, And
that's amazing.
Yeah, and so I was doing the Dummies books, and I did 4 or 5 books about the presidents and books about the founding fathers, and I did 2 UFO books, and I did a cookbook about the Beatles called She Came In Through the Kitchen Window, which is... That's true. It's recipes based on song titles of the Beatles. So there's, I Want to Hold Your Ham.
I love that.
Oh, yeah. It was the recipes were real, though. And what's interesting is that a lot of the recipes came from my Italian mother and many of my Italian aunts and grandparents, and traditional recipes that have been handed down in the family. So the book actually turned into this really cool a lot of Italian recipes cookbook, So I did 4 books about the Beatles. It's just been, and what's interesting? You ask how could that happen? I did 60 books in, we'll say, 30 years. That's like 2 a year. And the way I did it is that I'm fortunate in that I was able to write 2 books a year. So I was willing to take short contracts because, back then when I was writing for a living, it was, you get half on signing the contract, half of the advance, and then the other half on acceptance. So I was constantly churning contracts, either starting a book or finishing one, so that the money kept coming in. And after a while, and I tell my writing students this, and they can't believe it because of the difficulty, the way publishing is today. I mean, it's just, 30% were laid off during the pandemic, and I don't know if they're going to get rehired, frankly. But in any case, back then, half of my book, 60, 65 titles, I would say 30 of them were offered to me because I had developed a track record for turning stuff out that was as close to perfect as I could make them and doing well with sales. There's like 25 or 30 titles on my bibliography on my website that I never thought of. The publishers, they have idea meetings, and very often, they get in a room every 2 weeks and say, so what do you think? They say, we should do a book about Robin Williams. And the acquisition editors would be there, and they'd say, well, does anybody have an author who has pitched them a book about Robin Williams? No hands, of course. And then one editor to say, well, I'm working with Spignesi, and he just did a book on blah, blah. I'm sure he could handle it. Okay, offer it to him. And that's how half of my books came into being, because between us and our radio listeners, I said yes to everything.
We do the same thing. I get it.
Now, I had a mortgage. I had to buy my own health insurance. And when you work for yourself, you pay double Social Security tax because you're both the employer and employee. So I was constantly on the lookout for new contracts. And then it started fading. Publishing started going through a tightening the way the housing industry around 04, 05, 06, 07. So I contacted the chair of the English department at my alma mater, UNH. I said I'm available, and he brought me on that semester. And I ended up teaching full-time for 10 years and still writing, but only one book a year because I couldn't do both. And I was a practitioner, so I had 21 credits a year to teach. So I was busy. And so that's how my bibliography came into being. And now I'm retired from teaching. I'm older now, so I'm more comfortable doing like one major book a year and maybe a short book that doesn't require the kind of intensive research. And I've turned more to fiction. I have a novel that my co-author Rachel and I are finishing. I have a short story collection coming out in a couple months. So career has kind of evolved as everything changed. Reader interest, publisher interest, life. And so that's why I am where I am now.
We've been very fortunate with the people we've had on our show with guests. It's so great to meet people who have achieved the level of success they have by just putting their head down and doing the work, making it happen for themselves. It's a really cool message. With all of these topics, all these things, what is it that made you decide that King was going to be a big focal point for you, starting with that encyclopedia?
I ended up ultimately being an English teacher, but in high school and college, I focused on literature, and I went to a Catholic high school. And, it's funny, after I got in, I got a scholarship in my first year freshman English. I would talk to my friends, many of whom were going to, local public high schools, and I'd say, in your English class, what are you reading? What's going on? And they said, oh, we're reading 1984 or Of Mice and Men or Animal Farm. And I said, yeah, and what about next week? And, oh, no, that's it. That's where I went to high school. We were assigned a book a week. And in fact, one English course I took in high school, the assignment, it was only one book for the semester, but it was The Lord of the Rings.
Oh my God.
Three huge books, So I've always been a reader. I've always, since I was a kid, been a writer. And King just appeals to everything for me. He's an incredible storyteller. He's an excellent writer. And I often use the analogy, the metaphor of you don't see the words that, when you're reading King, when he's in the zone and there's some stuff happening, you're like pulled through the pages. It's like this symbiotic relationship between him and you. And I actually did an essay about that King, not only Spock can mind meld. That was the title, yeah.
That's amazing.
And it was about how King can connect. And so, obviously, I wanted to read everything he published, which I ended up doing. And then Lost Work came out because of all the extras that I had been finding doing research for the encyclopedia. And then the Essential Stephen King, which is now, it's in the archives because I ranked King's top 100 works from 1977 through 2000, I think, or 1998. I'm not sure what year. And it was completely subjective. But I did use literary criteria: plot, characterization, dialogue, tone, which is the same stuff I taught, comp and lit. And, it is a bit elitist to kind of claim this is better than that. But I'm sorry, I really believe that it is all right to say that this is better than this. The rule of law is better than theocracy. A two-room shack is not as good as the Buckingham Palace. I mean, we can't. There are comparisons that can be made. The rationale is always, greater good. What serves the greater good? And in terms of King, it was, what serves his body of work as being examples of true excellence. But now it's 30 years out of date. So and what he's released just in the last 10 years.
Oh,
10
yeah.
years. So there's no way of ever updating that. But it was of interest enough to me. He had written so much by then that I said, something? I would love to write about The Shining, The Dead Zone, The Green Mile, the novella collections, the short stories, the nonfiction essays. I would love to. I ended up compiling a bibliography of King from which I had to take 100 pieces as being true examples of his excellence. And so I did that, and then I moved on to, like, everything else. And 17 years later, one of my publishers said, is it time? And I said, well, Stephen King is 70 whatever now, but he's still churning out 1-2 books a year. But yeah, I feel I could put together a compendium that looks at his entire career through now. And so that's why I did Stephen King American Master. And I also have done Robin Williams American Master, and I am now working on Frank Sinatra American Master.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, so
it's a hell of
King
a three.
And you know something? If King didn't appeal to me at the level that he does, there's no way I would have been able to have the enthusiasm or the commitment to do the books I did, because the research alone is just mind-boggling. But, I've always had kind of like a split personality kind of as a writer. I can do academic level research and come up with real cool, how King kills. There's a list in my encyclopedia of all the ways that King killed off characters. It's great, and also can write in an accessible way. So,
I love you mentioned the mind meld thing, because what struck me when I was a kid reading King, why I just started picking up all of his books, is that for the first time in my life, reading a book sucked me in so fully that I had to take a break afterwards, because I got a little bit, I went through a period of grief after reading the Dark Tower series, what was published up through then, because I wasn't in that world anymore. And I didn't want to dive into another world because, it wasn't Roland and everyone, and I missed them already. And so I've never thought of it like Spock. And that's such a cool way to think about that.
That's the secret, isn't it? Creating these universes that you want to live in. And this is why my theory is that the reason technology has made binging TV commonplace. My theory is that the reason binging has become a phenomenon that people will commit to rewatching all 15 seasons of ER in a row and then start over is because of exactly what you brought up, Sam. The idea that this is a universe, a fully created universe with people, characters who become incredibly real. And it's a gift of the writer if they're able to do that. And this is why some people just fall in love with certain shows. And they just, I belong to a whole bunch of Facebook TV groups, and the more active are West Wing. People will watch the West Wing over and over and over. They will watch ER over and over. Game of Thrones, nonstop. They just continue to watch it. In fact, I just did a rewatch of The Good Wife with Juliana Margulies, and I just love that whole universe and her as the lead character. So, yes, you're right. When you nail down a particular book or series of books that just kind of become part of it, it's absolutely irresistible. And ultimately, what we're describing is the power of art. I mean, I know people who do this with music. I know people who do this with art. They just become so immersed. I met a group recently that it's totally into the work of Dutch 16th century artist Vermeer. Okay, remember the
just
girl
like
with the pearl earring? That painting.
Yeah,
he didn't do a lot of paintings, but there are groups that just focus on the minutia, every little, and have huge discussions about color usage and character usage and who is the girl with the pearl earring. Was it made like in the movie, in the book? No, it might have been his daughter. And from my reading, that seems to be the case, because her visage appears in a couple of other paintings that very similar to Girl with the Pearl Earring. So yeah, what you're describing is the power of art. And I just believe, the more art, the more evolved we become. The more exposure to art, regardless, music, painting, reading, the more evolved we become, because we're tapping into heartfelt emotions that are universal, but we may not have actually considered or experienced before digging this particular book or TV show.
Yeah, and re-exposure is incredibly important too, because I'm baffled when I meet people who don't reread books that they've already read, because it's how do you get something new out of every reading. Your life has changed. You have different, concepts of things. They hit you in different ways.
Oh, I got the perfect answer for you, Sam. When people say, you're rereading Pet Sematary? You're rereading the Dark Tower series? You're rereading it? You read it once. And my answer is always, yeah, I heard the White Album once, too.
Yeah, exactly.
But I listened to it constantly. And be, I never thought of it like that. Well, duh, of course you haven't.
Okay, I'll try that next time instead of running away and screaming.
It's because books take more time and are harder to re-experience. Mm-hmm. But the difference is ignorable because, you don't buy an album and listen to it once, unless you, of course, absolutely hate it. We have to throw that caveat in there.
Yeah.
But,
or you're some sort of monster who just buys things and then throws them away after one sitting.
With all of the things that you have gathered in your King career, what sort of unique King collectibles or tributes have you seen from the people you've met as you've met more and more King fans, the more research and stuff you've done?
Yeah, King fans are wild, and a lot of them create collectibles. There are companies that create, T-shirts with phrases from King's work on it. You've seen them, tote bags and so forth. But the single most unique collectible, aside from the asbestos fire starter.
Wait, what?
Oh yeah, there was an edition of Firestarter published in asbestos, bound in asbestos. There were 2 copies.
What?
And a friend of mine named Charlie Freed, who has passed away, he owned one of them. And when he passed away, he was in negotiations to buy the other one.
Wow.
But that's, a situation unto itself. But yeah, it was a Firestarter book bound in asbestos. And the other would be thanks to my girlfriend. My girlfriend, Valerie Barnes, she has long been a King fan, and for a while she was a very important collector. She bought tons of limiteds. In fact, I tell this story, several years ago, she sold 3 of her limited editions that had, of course, appreciated, and bought a brand new Kia automobile with the money.
I am desperate to ask about that because I read that in your book, Stephen King, American Master, the interview with her, and I have collectibles, and I understand doing that to get something that you need. A car is very important, but it would also break my heart. Was it hard for her?
No, she was at the point where she pretty much she's got a big signed Tabitha King collection too. But the King collectibles, they weren't something that she really said, no, I have to own this forever. Mm-hmm. One was, I think she had the stainless steel My Pretty Pony with the digital clock in the cover.
Oh,
and it was huge and expensive, and she didn't have room on her shelf. She lives in an apartment, and her shelf space was running, and she needed a car.
Sure.
So it was, and a lot of people do consider collectible, signed, limited, slip-cased books as investments. And so she actually actualized. Yeah, good, Steve. You're a writer, yeah. She actually actualized the notion that some King books make wonderful investments. And so she just did it, and she found a buyer immediately and kind of rescued her from having to take a loan, So, and then she has continued, although now she's branched out and she's reading all kinds of things now. But she made what I consider the single most unique, that's also bad, most unique collectible in the King universe, which is a satin workout jacket, white, and the back has the Rock Bottom Remainders logo with every member in it hand-stitched on the entire back of the jacket. And on the front of each jacket, one says Steve and one says Val. And the Steve, she gave to Stephen King in person, and he was just delighted with it. And she still has the one with her name on it. And we've never had them appraised. They were very costly, as you can imagine, because they were all hand-stitched. We've never had them appraised. She has no interest in selling the one she owns. But to me, that kind of that's like a quintessential definition of collectible. Because when there's only one, only one person can collect it. And that makes it very, very rare. So that in particular, and the Firestarter asbestos.
Is the jacket like hanging up on display?
Oh, no. She's got it sealed in plastic with, moth and resistant. And oh no, it's up on a shelf. And once in a while, if I ask nicely, she'll take it down and show it to me.
I would love to see a picture of it.
She's very serious about her collection. She has she sold them, but she has the 4 original Richard Bachman paperbacks. As the year they were published, when they just had Bachman on them.
Mm-hmm.
And they were sealed in plastic, and she'd had them for years. And I was teaching a course on Stephen King at University of New Haven, the new Gothic horror of Stephen King. And I said, let me take the books to school. Let me do a show and tell. And show the kids this really cool collectible, these rare King paperbacks. She said no. No. She wouldn't even let me take them out of the plastic. So she was a serious collector, but has kind of scaled back in recent years. But,
I have a contingency plan if my house ever catches on fire, exactly how I'm going to get my most prized bookshelf out of the house at risk of my life.
I hear you.
Let's talk about some of your books in a little more detail. We talked about the complete Stephen King encyclopedia. It took you 5 years. What was the experience like of putting that book together?
I had one assistant, my dearly departed mom, as I mentioned, was a voracious reader, very, very smart. But she came from a somewhat patriarchal Italian family, and she could have been a nurse or a doctor. But back in the day, girls graduated high school and then got a job and then got married.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, there were many, many exceptions of girls being able to go to college, but my mom wasn't able to. However, she was intellectually superior. So she always followed my career. She was my biggest fan. And when I came up with the idea of the King book, she loved King. And so I said, the only problem is, I want to do it like I did the Mayberry book. And the Mayberry book is basically the people, places, and things of everything in all 249 episodes of The Andy Griffith Show. So if Otis mentions something, a still or a bottle or a brand or a recipe in one episode, it got an entry in the things section for that episode. So I told my mother, I said, I want to do the same thing with King. Little realizing what I was actually wanting to do. And so after I started it, and I started with Carrie, and I just started taking notes, rereading the book, and every time a person, place, or thing appeared, making a note and jotting it down, and then I figured I'd go back and write the entries. Well, it just became insanely overwhelming. I was working full-time for a family business at the time, and I just couldn't. So Mom was working as a clerk in a stationery store in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and her boss was rarely there. And my mother ran the store and did very, very well with it and so forth. But she had a lot of downtime. And I know a lot of people bring books to read when they have nothing to do but ring a cash register or whatever. So Mom, she bought a stack of legal pads from her very own stationery store, and she began taking notes on every work that I gave her from King. And, to this day, I can see the filing cabinet in my apartment, and the bottom 2 drawers are filled with those notated legal pads from which I took all the information she had compiled and wrote plain text entries and then ran them through a processor to alphabetize and so forth. So it was huge. And as I was doing that, I came to know more and more and more people in the King community. And before long, I was contributing to Castle Rock. the newsletter, updating readers about the progress of the encyclopedia, actually. I was also interviewing. I was taping them and transcribing them myself by listening to a cassette tape. And some of these interviews were 10,000 words long. So Richard Christian Matheson's was enormous, and it took forever to transcribe, but it was a great interview. And I interviewed his father, Richard Matheson, and well, the book, you can see the list of people who I got to talk to. And then other ideas started springing up. Well, hey, what about if we index this? And what about if we add this? I told you the How King Kills features.
Yeah.
And then people started volunteering. Chris Chesley, who wrote with King when they were children, he offered a new short story he had written, and my book is the only place it's been published. And when I get it, he also gave me a drawing of the particular building in New Mexico, the story, I think it's called The Mission, and he had actually sketched it, drawn it. So that's in there. And we had artists contributing, and it just became, you're asking about what kind of an experience it was. It was the most compelling, fascinating, and stressful creative experience of my entire writing career. Because, guys, I wouldn't give up. Even when
it sounds like you opened a Pandora's box of literature and just had to deal with everything that came out.
It was beyond daunting. Daunting, particularly when I would get to a book like Skeleton Crew and realize that I had to take notes on every story in the people, places, and things format. And Night Shift, and for different seasons, and 4 Past Midnight, and every person, every place, everything. But, I'm just so glad that I was young enough and had enough stamina to be able to do it. Because, guys, there's no way I'd do it now. I mean, I had COVID, and now I've got long COVID, and I'm exhausted all the time.
Well, I have to congratulate you. No one has ever made us cry on our own podcast until today.
Man, talking about the
filing cabinet.
That,
oh my gosh,
that hit me real hard. That's so amazing that you still have that. That's got to be such a grateful thing to have.
I still look at them. I still open the drawer and just pull out a pad, and say, "Oh, look, this is Mom's Christine legal pad." And I flipped through it, and in her handwriting, there's all the people, places, and things of Christine. Yeah, it was quite something. And in fact, I'm going to give 1 or 2 of these pads to my siblings. Just kind of, to commemorate Mom, because now she's gone a year. We grieved for a year, and we still are grieving, but now there's more activity, quote unquote, in terms of like talking about her and remembering things, and you know how it is, So I'm thinking I may give a pad or 2 to each of my sibs, and they'll just,
that's beautiful.
They knew that that's how it happened, but none of them have ever seen her stack of notes, So I think it'll mean a lot. I hope it will anyway,
Yeah. Another one of your books that I really wanted to talk about was the lost work of Stephen King. Please tell me about what is a lost work of Stephen King?
A lost work of Stephen King is anything that is not a novel or a short story collection. Because not everything that ends up on the New York Times bestseller list is everything King has published. And so as I was doing the research, and I had the master list of all his short stories, and then I discovered that he wrote such and such, and it only appeared in such and such. And I'm saying, wait a minute, it wasn't collected? Well, I got to put that over here then. I got to start another list. And then I'd find that he did nonfiction essays. And I said, oh, wait a minute, what's this? My Little Serrated Security Blanket by Stephen King. What is that? And it turns out to be a review, a comical review that Steve wrote for Outside Magazine about an ice axe. And he wrote it ostensibly as a review of the product for people who were into rock climbing and ice climbing.
That's wild.
But of course, knowing it's King, of course, he had to figure out just how deep it would go into a skull. And I'm saying to myself, wow, King fans would love this stuff. Now, I didn't get rights to republish any of the lost works that I cover in the book. I cover about 75 pieces because we just had no budget, and who knows if they'd even want them to license the rights. But the point is, I covered the story. For each chapter, I gave a likelihood of a fan being able to actually find it. King did book reviews for the New York Times Book Review, and they were never mainstream published other than that Sunday that they appeared, but they contained classic King writing. And so I would often refer fans to libraries. I said, go to the library and give the librarian this date and the title of the piece, and when she brings you the microfiche or whatever, print out photocopies, and now you've got a King essay that you would never have been able to see. And so we even did that I have a copy of all his college writings. King's Garbage Truck, he wrote a column when he was in college for the University of Maine called King's Garbage Truck, and basically there's dozens and dozens of essays published weekly that included movie reviews, comments on culture, talk about cops, about violence, about Vietnam. And so I wrote about that. And Slade, he wrote a 5-piece comical essay, a Western, that really kind of, to me, suggests future Dark Tower kind of stuff, even though it's a comedy and it's, but it's the only work he ever wrote that has the appearance of a hot air balloon. A hot air balloon crashes into a barn on fire and kills Polly Peachtree, one of the main characters of Slade. And so I told fans about that, and basically I had like 75 pieces that some were completely inaccessible, but were fun to read about, and some, with a little bit of digging, could be found. So that was the overall approach of the lost work of Stephen King. We are working on volume 2. A lot of things that King has published. In fact, he did 2 major pieces for the New York Times Book Review. One was a review of a biography of Raymond Carver, the American short story writer. I'm a big fan of his. Also, the collected Carver. King wrote 2 major pieces for the Times Book Review about Carver, who he says has influenced him, and I'm talking about those. And that's accessible stuff, too. So I kind of saw it as my goal to turn readers on to stuff that isn't available at Barnes & Noble, that they could find and read, because King fans, most of the time, they want more King. And to read him in the context of a nonfiction essay about this, or a movie review of movies they've seen, or his thoughts on the Vietnam War. I mean, this is all stuff that appeals to serious fans, and so that was the goal of the book.
I can only imagine just the lengths at which you had to go to find some of these. It's so cool. Are you still working on Stephen King American Master?
No, Stephen King American Master came out a year ago, and I am working on an expanded edition of that book as a signed limited edition with the Overlook Connection Press. I'm going to add a few more chapters, a couple interviews, a few more essays. I am working on that. I am currently focused on finishing Crystal Palace, which is the novel I'm co-writing with a student of mine, Rachel. We've been working on it for years. It takes place in 2 timelines, 1851 and 2015. And there are 2 main female characters, Amelia and Cecilia, and it has a reincarnation plotline. And it's just, each chapter alternates from 1851 to 2015. And it was influenced by Dickens and Charlotte Bronte. And turns out that we're not actually mimicking their style, but you can sense in the voice of our writing that the book has been influenced by Dickens and Bronte. So we think it's going to be a success because it's just a terrific read. And then, of course, I have the Frank Sinatra book due on September 1st, which I'm somewhat behind on because of the after effects of COVID, but I'm working on that. And again, finalizing the short story collection called The Overnight Hours, which is coming out in a couple months. So, yeah, keep them busy.
Yeah, that's a lot to look forward to.
Yeah, no kidding. Before we wrap things up, we're at the end of our time. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our listeners? Anything you haven't had the chance to say?
basically, what I would always tell students is that if you want to write, write. By the way, can I say ass?
You sure
Yeah,
can.
I can say whatever you want.
Okay, because there's a formula, and I think a sports writer came up with it. Writing equals ass plus chair. And so I always encourage my students, I would say, listen, you want to write? Write. Don't think about who's going to buy the publishers or that you need an agent or who's going to want to buy it or what the cover is going to look like. Don't think about any of that. Simply sit down and write, because you cannot rewrite until you write. Do not find the notion of writing something so daunting that you just freeze.
Mm-hmm.
And that has always kind of inspired. And then you know what I do? I tell them the Beatles story because I was working on Beatles books when I was teaching. And I would say to them, just remember something. You guys, you're 17, 18, 19, right? Paul McCartney was finished with the Beatles when he was 26. He hadn't even turned 30, and he changed the world, as did John, George, and Ringo. I said, if they can do it, they're inspired. They were inspired. They worked hard. They got rejected. They slummed it. They had no money, and yet they believed in their art. I said, so that's what I would always tell people, particularly aspiring writers and artists of all types. Do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then worry about what you're going to do. And frankly, aspiring writers, musicians, painters, etc., in this day and age with the internet and self-publishing and Amazon Kindle DP, your work can find an audience much simpler than when I was starting out in the 80s. So that's basically my point. Just try a bit of inspiration to not give up and continue. And, anytime when I sold my first novel, it was to Random House in 2005. It's called Dialogues, and got a really, really big advance for it. This was after like 50 books. And my agent, agents they can be a tad cynical, he said to me, wow, you're a 30-year overnight success. I said, yeah, I guess so, huh? And so basically that would be my message, which is never give up, keep doing it, because if you don't do something you set your mind to, in a year, you still will not have done it.
Right.
If you set your mind to doing something, in a year you'll have something. It may be awful. And I tell the story about how King got so many rejections that he had to put a railroad spike in the wooden beam of his apartment that he shared with his brother in Durham, Maine. And every time a short story got rejected, he would spike the rejection slip onto this spike. And it started as a nail. And then he got so many rejections that he ended up replacing it with a big, thick spike to have room. And I said, and that is Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, it's if you want a career in the arts, you got to work for it and never give up. Never take no for an answer. So that would be my final word, I guess.
Awesome. Once again, thank you to our wonderful guest, Stephen Spignesi, for taking the time to talk with us. If you're looking to get your hands on any of Stephen's books, they are available on Amazon. For Stephen Spignesi and CM Alexander, this is Joshua Kahn reminding you, if you want to write, write.
Hey everyone, CM Alexander here. Thank you for listening to our interview with Stephen Spignesi. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like more of Stephen, you can find him at stephenspignesi.weebly.com. That's all for now, listeners. Goodbye.